out in the lands of danger and flame. Heroes of legend are making their name. Swords and spells with hearts full of zest. They ride with pride on a quest of interest. Heckfire Club, riding through the night. Heckfire Club, standing for what's right. Mystic lands and monsters to face. They're saving the world at a breakneck pace. From the Verdant province to Dragon's Lair, wicked wizards and trolls beware. With the rogue a knight and a mage so wise, they'll outwit danger and claim the prize. Legends told round campfire flames of secret spells and forgotten names. A hidden power, an ancient key. The fate of the realm is their destiny. Heckfire Club, riding through the night. Heckfire Club, standing for what's right. Curses, traps, and mysteries deep. No dragon's hoard is out of reach. They laugh at danger, they don't play it safe. Each wild adventure's a tale of interest. A caress. Heckfire Club, tales of interest.
The descent from the temple was quieter than their ascent. The warm breeze had returned, carrying with it a faint hum of bamboo leaves swaying in the wind, a stark contrast to the biting cold that had gripped the valley just days prior. Zirath led the way, his frame steady under the weight of Master Leyu's unconscious form. The monk's once unyielding strength was now a fragile presence, his breathing shallow and uneven. The twisted steps of the ascending serpent staircase sharpened and steepened as they descended, each turn revealing a new vista of the misty valley below. The monks who had once guarded the stairs and temple entrance now walked alongside the party, not a hint of menace or resentment to be found. They did not speak, and their usual demeanour of quiet reverence persisted. Zirath privately appreciated their relative silence. Thomas glanced briefly at the polearm-wielding monk who still carried herself with unshakable poise. She walked just ahead, her curved blade glinting faintly in the light. He imagined what it would have been like to face her in battle, especially on such treacherous ground. When they had reached the village where the monk masters and acolytes had gathered, Celia continued tending to Master Leyu. She brewed salves and healing draughts, helping him regain some measure of strength. It would take time, he was not merely wounded. Master monks were known to be able to endure prolonged periods without food or water. However, the long month of struggle against elemental forces in the temple had exacted a toll which would test even those limits. In periods of lucidity over the next few days, the recovering master would stir, describing seeing chains stretching across the land, their links forged from gold and silver, gleaming under the sun. Yet, one by one, those chains snapped, the broken links crumbling to dust as they fell into the earth. He saw himself standing atop a mountain, buffeted by a raging storm. The winds howled through the jagged peaks as the elements clashed violently. Fire roared against water, earth crumbled into the sky, and nothing remained restrained. At the storm's heart, a throne of molten stone emerged, glowing with searing heat. Upon it sat a figure wreathed in ash and flame, their presence commanding, a broken crown of jade held loosely in their hands. Shadows writhed behind the figure, shifting and coiling like serpents in the dark. But it was the final image that seemed to trouble Leyu most, the vast web stretching out across the void. Its strands shimmered faintly, trembling with each movement of the unseen spider at its centre. Every twitch of its legs sent ripples through the web, invisible vibrations that shook the very threads of the world. In the days that followed, the adventurers were offered something exceedingly rare, the collective wisdom of the great monk masters. At this table they exchanged their own fragmented tales in return. Their encounters with the Orbs of Vestra, the shifting tides of power, and the escalating chaos threatening to consume the province. One of the elder monks, his weathered face etched with lines of wisdom, nodded subtly. He spoke of the carvings within the cavern of the Oni. One such carving, he said, suggested the story of how the Oni came to wake in the mortal realm, a depiction of a breaking sky, where the falling pieces into sea, mountain, and forests had woken Oni spirits into material form. Zirath, still carrying the fractured Vestran orb, drew the attention of Raish al Ghul. The half-orc's piercing gaze lingered on his pack which contained the orb, before turning to Zirath. There was no need for words. Both understood the significance of what had been uncovered. The monks had their stories and legends, yet still none truly knew the nature of the orbs. Friz, as usual, scribbled furiously in her notebook. Her thoughts churned with possibilities as she pieced together the threads of shared lore. It was becoming clear to her that every culture, every civilization, carried echoes of the same myth, a forgotten cataclysm that had reshaped the world, scattering pieces of a celestial body which had reached the material world. Her mind worked tirelessly to connect the dots, even as her hands trembled with the weight of revelation. The headmaster, she feared, had been correct. The nature of the orbs had long been stricken from the histories. The adventurers gathered their resolve. The path before them was clear. They would return to Mystra's Arcane Institute. There, within the hallowed halls of the Tower of the Deadlore, they hoped to find answers to the questions that haunted their every step. As the group prepared to depart, Raish al Ghul approached Zora with a measured stride, his towering presence casting a long shadow in the fading light. His gaze lingered on the half-elf barbarian, and there was a rare weight to his expression, an acknowledgement of respect that Raish did not offer lightly. He spoke with calm that betrayed his size and ferocity, granting that he and his companions had earned the title of friend to the monks. Few outsiders could claim such a bond, and fewer still would be granted the freedom to walk these sacred hills without challenge. It was an honor not given lightly, and Raish made it clear that Zora's name would be known among the monasteries as a friend. But the half-orc's words carried a warning as well. Though the monks kept the peace in the valleys, not all who wandered the hills were bound by the same code of honor. Oni, oathbreaker Ronin, and restless spirits born of elemental chaos and ancient grudges still roamed. While the monks would welcome Zora with open arms, he should never mistake the valleys for tame lands. Zora offered a respectful nod to the master. Raish al Ghul, satisfied with the exchange, gave a final glance to the party before turning away, the quiet breeze carrying with it a sense of both blessing and caution. The party expressed their gratitude to Celia for her unwavering guidance and the resolve she had shown in finding Zora. Her task, entrusted by her master, had been completed. Yet, before she could take her leave, her master from the Temple of the Open Hand had one more duty for her to fulfill. She was asked to remain in the valley a while longer, as Master Leyu's strength was not yet fully restored, and he would need her unique abilities to recover from the ordeal that had left him weakened. Celia accepted the task without hesitation. She would stay, tending to the wounded master and preparing the valley for whatever dangers lay ahead. The party made their way from the bamboo hills with a renewed sense of purpose, spurred by the warmer nights. When the spice fields of Saffron Sands finally came into view, they were far less wilted than when they had last seen them. The lingering frost was gone, and vibrant colours were beginning to peek through the soil. The few people they crossed on the roads, workers carrying bushels of crops, were dressed in the usual bright, colourful linens made in the region. The bright dyes derived from the spices harvested were more brilliant in the sun than when covered in frost. Thomas found himself thinking back to Celia's family and the struggle they had faced. He recalled the hardship they had seen in Saffron Sands, the crops withering under the unnatural cold, and a sly grin crept across his face. He had an idea. It wasn't the sort of idea Thomas would discuss in detail with the group, as it involved a certain incantation he had once learned during a previous venture of dubious legality. Suffice it to say, the spell was meant to encourage agricultural growth. When they stopped at a small village along the Spice Road, Thomas decided to test his newfound sense of altruism. He casually inquired about the fields used to grow materials for healing potions, suggesting with just the right amount of nonchalance that they might be worth visiting. The villagers, intrigued by his interest, led him to the patch of withered crops. With a flourish of his hands and a muttered incantation, Thomas performed the spell. He wasn't entirely sure what to expect, but by the next morning, the once barren fields were teeming with life. Green shoots had burst from the earth, leaves unfurled, and blossoms open to the sun. The villagers, wide-eyed and grateful, insisted on rewarding the party with something special. They gifted them a rare draught, healing potions of a quality far greater than what one might find in even the finest apothecaries. Thomas accepted the reward with a gracious nod, outwardly humble but inwardly relieved. He had sincerely hoped that would be the result. But then again, he was who he was. His schemes rarely came without risk, but this time it seemed fortune had favoured him, or at least the crops. From Saffron Sands, the party secured horses. Their saddles worn but sturdy thanks to the writ of travel granted by the headmaster of Mystra's Arcane Institute. The official document bypassed the increasingly draconian travel permits, sparing them both time on foot and the irritating tolls demanded at every checkpoint. As they approached the gates of Inkwell, the familiar sign announcing the festival tax greeted them, the price of entry for all outsiders. The line to pay had grown shorter with each visit, and it was clear the once bustling festival city was steadily losing its allure to travellers. Where crowds had once gathered to enjoy music, art and theatre, now only a trickle of visitors shuffled forward, begrudgingly handing over their coins. The guards stationed at the post weren't the seasoned veterans the party remembered. Thomas, ever the keen observer, sized them up with a quick glance. These were young men, perhaps locals drafted into service, their armour ill-fitting and their eyes lacking the sharpness of experience. He noted their weariness, and the way their hands hovered over their coin pouches rather than their weapons. They weren't sold on the merits of the law, that much was clear. Thomas, leaning on charm and a few sly words, suggested a quicker transaction. The guard, after a moment's hesitation, pocketed the gold and waved them through without bothering with the paperwork. Thomas smiled to himself, satisfied, though he suspected the guard would spend his newfound wealth at the nearest tavern before his shift ended. Friz observed the exchange with narrowed eyes. It wasn't just laziness, she noted. It was a symptom of something larger. The city's best guards had likely been drawn away by the newly mandated guild contracts, lured by the promise of riches and adventure. What remained behind were the dregs, easily bribed and hardly vigilant. She couldn't help but wonder what else might pass through Inkwell's gates for the right sum. The thought left her uneasy. Inside the city, the warming weather had brought a touch of life back to the streets. Plays, bards, tale-tellers, and buskers performed on street corners, their performances more spirited than during the party's last visit. But even the brighter atmosphere couldn't mask the underlying tension. There were fewer crowds to gather coins, and Friz wondered how long these artists could survive on dwindling patronage. She feared the city seemed to be living on borrowed time, its heartbeat quieter with each passing day. The party approached Mystra's Arcane Institute, its pristine white walls gleaming in the afternoon light. Towering above the city of Inkwell, the institute stood as a beacon of knowledge and arcane power, its deep purple flags bearing the silver star of Mystra. Beyond the grand gates, an expansive courtyard stretched out, centred by an enchanted fountain of eternal flame. The fire crackled brightly, never consuming its source, a testament to the elemental mastery of Mystra's teachings and the timeless legacy of the institute. It was the oldest, largest, and most prestigious school of arcana in the known world, its reputation reaching beyond Verdun's borders. Rising at the heart of the institute was the tower of the headmaster, its marble surface catching the light like polished stone. Inside the walls they approached the registrar and, as usual, gave the required password. By now, the old owl joke had grown stale, eliciting muffled groans from the party. Even Thomas, who loved a good running gag, rolled his eyes at the familiar quip. The registrar was none the less thrilled, They suspected his days were long and dull. The spiral staircase leading to the headmaster's office remained as imposing as ever, winding upward through the tower's ancient halls, lined with arcane relics and dust-covered tomes. At the top, they found Headmaster Alric Madris seated at his desk, buried beneath a mountain of scrolls and letters. He barely glanced up as they entered, his quill scratching furiously across parchment. He took a deep breath and bade them come in. They sat and the story poured from them. The adventurers recounted their tale of the Temple of the Four Elements, their words filling the quiet chamber of the headmaster's study. They spoke of Master Leyu's vision, chains of gold and silver snapping apart, a raging storm tearing the elements asunder, and a throne of molten stone at the heart of a vast spiderweb. Each detail hung in the air like a spectre, heavy with foreboding. The headmaster listened in silence, his hands steepled beneath his chin, his gaze distant as though peering into some unseen horizon. When the party finished, he remained still for a long moment, his quill lying forgotten beside the stack of letters on his desk. Finally he spoke. He warned them of the dangers of mortal minds interpreting visions. Divination, he explained, was a delicate art, an intrusion into the magics that governed the very flow of existence. The threads of fate were complex, infinite, and interwoven. No mortal mind could fully comprehend their patterns without risking error. Friz nodded as he spoke, her thoughts drifting to the book he had given her on their last visit, The Fall of Empires. The headmaster referenced it now, recalling cautionary tales of thriving civilizations brought low or driven to committing horrors by visions or divine mandates. Still, the headmaster could not deny the imagery of the vision held meaning. The broken chain clearly suggested a fracture in unity, the unravelling of bonds that once held people and realms together. The storm spoke of chaos, forces unleashed, uncontrollable and destructive. And the image of a spider behind a throne, weaving its unseen web, brought a grave parallel to the core argument of the book Friz carried. Empires did not simply collapse. They were often brought low by hidden hands, by those who worked in shadows to manipulate power. As he leaned back in his chair, the headmaster's expression darkened. The spider in the vision, he explained, echoed forces acting from the periphery of power, a threat that wouldn't strike openly, but would erode from within, weaving its web through the fabric of society. Such threats were often dismissed until it was too late. He advised caution, reminding them that not all battles were fought with steel and spells. Some wars were waged in whispers through manipulation and deceit. Despite the weight of their exchange, it was time to act. The party had gleaned all they could from Mystra's archives and Master Leyu's vision. The only path forward now led to the Tower of the Deadlore, the realm that held forbidden knowledge locked away by the gods themselves. It was there, the headmaster explained, that they might uncover the truth behind the Vestran orbs, their purpose, and the power they held. It was there that the answers awaited, if they were brave enough to claim them. The headmaster led them through the quiet halls of Mystra's tower, up to a secluded perch at its very peak. At the back of his study stood a shrine, hidden behind the towering stacks of scrolls and books. The pristine white marble walls of the tower faded here to a darker stone, polished smooth by centuries of reverent use. Within the small alcove, two statues stood silently at the heart of the shrine. The first depicted the old god of wisdom, his solemn expression carved with ageless knowledge, his hand resting gently on the shoulder of a woman. The woman, clad in flowing robes, was none other than Mystra herself. Together, they gazed sadly upon the pedestal before them, a symbol of reverence and sacrifice. As they approached, the headmaster explained the shrine's purpose. This was where offerings of knowledge were made, texts, artifacts, runes of unimaginable power. Anything too dangerous or too potent for mortal hands was placed on the pedestal and taken to the Tower of the Deadlore, where it would be guarded for eternity by a being known as the Lord Mindflayer. He spoke of the Lord Mindflayer as one would speak of a force of nature, a creature beyond comprehension who existed solely to consume and guard forbidden knowledge. The headmaster's voice remained steady as they reached the shrine, but there was a tension beneath his words. He confessed his reason for trading the Codex of Karzak, a desperate barter, but a worthy calculation. He had deduced it could be used as a bargaining chip with the Lord Mindflayer. Dark knowledge and mysteries, he explained, was meant to be absorbed into his realm. But to remove knowledge from the Deadlore Tower was another matter entirely. It would require an offering of immeasurable power, something dark, rare, and valuable enough to tip the scales in their favor. He judged himself capable of sending them to the tower's plane of existence, but their return was far from guaranteed. The risks were immense, and even his mastery of arcane magic could not assure their safety. That was when Friz, lost in thought, reached into her satchel, her mind suddenly alive with possibility. She withdrew a book she had collected during one of their earlier exploits, a dark, forbidden tome that had nearly cost them their lives. Bound in cracked leather, it reeked of ancient power. The book contained blood magic rituals used in the transmutation of gold. Riches gained at a terrible cost, the exchange of souls and blood for wealth. It was a relic of the Soul Render, a monstrous being whose name still haunted them. The party agreed, or at least hoped, that it might be enough to secure both their passage to the tower and their safe return. The headmaster's eyes darkened as he examined the tome. With a resigned nod, he slipped the owl-shaped ring from his finger. The silver ring shimmered with ancient enchantments, its sapphire eyes glinting in the dim light. He placed it carefully on the pedestal and began to recite a slow, deliberate incantation. As his voice rose, the air around the pedestal shimmered, rippling with arcane energy. A dark void began to open, no larger than a coin at first, swirling with a depthless blackness that seemed to consume light itself. The headmaster repeated the incantation again and again, each repetition straining him further. He had never sent beings into this realm. Sweat beaded on his brow, and his hands trembled with the effort. Slowly, the void widened, large enough to fit the book, then larger still. Finally, it stretched wide enough for even Zirath to step through. The headmaster strained, his breath ragged, but he bid them leap in before he collapsed. The sun was setting on Inkwell as one by one, the adventurers stepped forward into the void. The darkness swallowed them whole as the dusk's waning light faded. As the party emerged from the swirling void, they found themselves standing on the jagged edge of a cliff, carved from obsidian stone, overlooking a nightmarish expanse, the black Star Sea. The vast ocean stretched endlessly before them, a cosmic abyss where faint stars shimmered like dying embers, their light flickering and fading into the void. But the waters of this strange sea did not move with familiar tides. Instead, they twisted in slow, deliberate spirals, each churn reflecting the fractured nature of reality itself. Perched upon this cliff, looming over the endless dark, stood the Tower of Deadlore. Its spires twisted impossibly high into the starless sky, black stones spiraling upward like the skeletal fingers of some ancient clawing hand. The walls of the tower were etched with intricate runes, their markings pulsing with a dark red glow. The light was faint, but it moved with a steady rhythm, as though the tower itself was breathing, alive, aware, and watching. Each pulse of crimson light sent ripples through the air, distorting the space around it. Gravity seemed fickle near the tower's base, pulling and loosening in irregular intervals, making each step feel unsteady. Even sound was warped here, echoing strangely, dissonant notes lingering long after they should have faded. As they drew closer to the Tower of Deadlore, Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold wind sweeping across the black Star Sea. A familiar presence stirred within him, distant at first but growing sharper, a voice cold and whispering, slithering through his thoughts like a serpent through leaves. Baba Yaga, his patron, was stirring. Her words came with a note of displeasure. The ancient magic that pulsed through the air bent reality in ways even she found unfamiliar, and that made her wary. He felt her unease settle over him like a second skin, a reminder that for all her cunning and power she was weary of this place. At the end of the spiralling path stood a towering door of black iron, massive and imposing, its surface etched with runes that glowed faintly with crimson light. The door bore 7 arcane gear and wheel locks, each one crafted to represent an aspect of forbidden knowledge: life, death, time, reality, mind, creation, and destruction. The locks pulsed in slow, deliberate rhythms, their ancient symbols glowing and dimming like a heartbeat, resonating with the twisted energy of the realm. Friz studied the symbols with intense focus, her fingers hovering over the shifting runes as she tried to make sense of their patterns. Thomas, who had cracked his share of safes, began to turn the gears, hoping instinct would guide him through the challenge. Zirath and Zora stood watch, their tension growing as the locks pulsed faster, each beat quickening like a countdown. But the mechanism refused to budge. The gears turned under their hands but would not catch, and no matter how they arranged the runes, the locks remained steadfast. Frustration mounted as time slipped by unnoticed. The urgency in the air grew thick, each breath drawing tighter as the glowing symbols pulsed faster, casting flickering red light across the group. Just as they began to wonder if they had missed something vital, a low, resonant hum echoed through the air. Without warning, the locks disengaged on their own. The 7 seals unravelled like threads pulled from an ancient tapestry, each symbol melting away into crimson light before vanishing into the ether. With a deep groan, the iron doors creaked open, revealing the dark passage beyond. The adventurers exchanged uneasy glances. They had not solved the puzzle, and yet the tower had allowed them entry. Whether it was an invitation or a trap, they did not know. But as the doors stood wide, beckoning them into the unknown, they knew there was no turning back. As the great iron doors groaned open, they rushed to find cover, but something in the air shifted, a crackling surge of energy that pulsed outward from the tower like ripples on dark water. Friz saw it first, a faint crimson shimmer twisting through the air like tendrils of smoke. The swirling arcs of red energy writhed and coiled, creeping along the stone pathways, moving toward the tower as if drawn to its call. Urgency cutting through the eerie silence, they darted between jagged stones and warped pillars of bone. But in their haste, they underestimated the speed of the swirling magic. One by one, tendrils of arcane light brushed against them. First Thomas, then Friz, then Zora. Only the towering Zirath somehow escaped untouched. The moment the red energy touched them, their minds ignited in a blaze of sensation. It was like being caught in a storm of crashing memories and emotions, past regrets, forgotten fears, fleeting joys, and buried pains surging inward with the force of a tidal wave against a fragile boat. Thomas staggered as flashes of schemes, betrayals, and moments of triumph swept through him, while Friz gasped, clutching her head as fragmented spells and forgotten secrets unravelled in a chaotic torrent. The energy seared through their minds, overwhelming them before retreating like a wave pulling back from the shore. Dizzy and disoriented, they stumbled through the tower's entrance, hearts pounding and breaths ragged. Though the red swirls continued their slow slither up the dark spires, the lingering echoes of that psychic assault clung to them. They found themselves in a grand library, an endless archive of forbidden knowledge. The towering bookcases stretched impossibly high, vanishing into the endless dark above. There were no ladders, no obvious means of reaching the upper shelves. The shelves themselves were packed with scrolls, ancient tomes, and pressed hides covered in burned markings, each one inscribed with words in 100 languages. Many of those languages were lost to time, forgotten by the mortal world. Others seemed entirely alien, their symbols twisting on the page, resisting comprehension. Friz was unnerved by the swirl of excitement and fear stirring within her. Scattered throughout the room were long tables, some of them covered with open books, their pages frozen mid-turn as though someone had left them behind in haste. Others held closed volumes, their bindings cracked and ancient. Zora's gaze drifted downward, and he noticed something strange. The floor, though polished and dark, held traces of dust in the corners and edges. But there were no random footprints. Instead, a singular path wound through the dust, weaving from one bookcase to another, tracing an intricate pattern across the library. It was clear that someone, or something, regularly stalked this library. They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing faintly in the vast space. They knew better than to touch the books. The knowledge stored here was dangerous, and even a curious glance could lead to ruin. In a concussive shock they froze, mid-step, mid-breath. Their bodies locked in place, unable to move, but their minds were anything but still. A presence, cold, invasive, and utterly overwhelming, slithered into their thoughts. Grasping tendrils crawled across their consciousness, wrapping around their memories like strangling vines. The voice that followed resonated from within, not spoken aloud, but vibrating in the core of their being. It was ancient, patient, and deeply unsettling. The Lord Mindflayer had made his presence known. The resonant voice in their minds spoke of their trespass into this realm, laced with a tone of disdain and curiosity. The pact of the tower was clear. Knowledge was to be harboured here, hidden away from mortal eyes. Mortals were not meant to walk these halls, and they were not welcome. The voice pressed, the tendrils creeping deeper into their thoughts, demanding what they had come to offer. Zirath, his resolve steady despite the psychic assault, was the first to answer. He spoke of the Codex of Karzak, the forbidden tome they had recovered, a collection of dark knowledge tied to a master artificer whose twisted creations had nearly destroyed them. The moment Zirath spoke the name, the Mindflayer seemed to breathe in the notion of the Codex, savouring it like a rare delicacy. Their minds convulsed under the weight of the creature's focus. Zirath, steady despite the intrusion, spoke first of the exchange. They were seeking knowledge about the Orbs of Vestra. At that, the tendrils tightened, winding deeper into their minds, pulling memories and secrets to the surface. The invasive touch was suffocating, peeling back their thoughts layer by layer. The Mindflayer lingered on the mention of the orbs, his voice shifting to something darker, more sinister. Extracting that knowledge, the Mindflayer told them, would not come without a price. The orbs carried a cost beyond mere understanding. To take such knowledge would require a sacrifice, one they would have to be willing to make. Then mercifully the Mindflayer relented. His voice curled through their minds again, explaining that the Codex of Karzak would earn them the right to walk the tower. Knowledge such as that, dark, potent and forbidden, had value here. They could make their offering in the Hall of the Forgotten. A vision of an ascent in the tower webbed into their minds. Their path was upward. The Mindflayer then posed a single question, one that hung in their minds with unnerving simplicity.
Who am I?
The question seemed absurdly simple. Trickery. A riddle. Each of them considered the possible traps hidden in those 3 words. It was Zora who spoke first, his voice steady and certain in his mind. The Lord Mindflayer. The moment he answered, the tendrils of thought loosened their grip and slithered away. Their bodies eased, tension melting from their muscles, and they could breathe freely again. The oppressive presence receded, though its lingering shadow remained. Then they heard it. Loud, flat thuds echoed through the silent library. 1, 2, 3. Each sound a heavy, concussive impact that seemed to vibrate through the dark stone of the tower. The rhythmic pounding grew louder, more frequent, until it became a steady drumming that reverberated off the towering shelves. Their eyes scanned the darkened library, searching for the source of the noise. Whatever was coming was drawing closer. The rhythmic thuds continued, louder, closer. The scent of decay clung to the air, acrid and stinging, turning their stomachs with each breath. Thomas noticed fresh trails carved through the dust on the floor, leading from the shelves to the open space of the library. His pulse quickened as he realized what the trails meant. He opened his mouth to warn the others, but it was already too late. They came from the shadows, gnarled, snarling creatures that should not have existed. Twisted, ancient tomes, grown grotesquely large, their leather bindings fused with rotting flesh, their spines warped into pulsing veins. Razor-sharp teeth lined their cracked pages, each snap of their covers echoing through the library like the clatter of steel jaws. The smell of acid hung heavy around them, the creatures oozing a corrosive slime that hissed as it dripped onto the stone floor. There was no time to think. The cursed tomes charged. Zora, with a growl of fury, stepped forward to meet the onslaught. His axe gleamed in the crimson light as he swung it in wide, brutal arcs. The first tome lunged at him, pages fluttering like wings, but he brought his weapon down with a mighty roar, cleaving it in two. The pieces writhed on the floor, still snapping at the air, before dissolving into pools of acidic goo. Meanwhile, Thomas weaved through the melee with practiced ease, his dark magic crackling at his fingertips. He hurled a blast of eldritch energy, striking one of the cursed tomes mid-leap. The creature twisted in the air, its pages curling and burning under the impact before it crashed to the floor, writhing in agony. Thomas grinned, his eyes gleaming with mischief, before turning to face the next threat. But it was Friz who found herself in the greatest danger. The tomes sensed something in Friz, perhaps her magical aura, and swarmed her in a flurry of snapping pages and acidic fumes. They circled her like vultures, ripping at her robes and tearing into her flesh with razor-sharp teeth. She screamed in pain, her blood staining the dark floor beneath her. Desperately, she raised her hands and cast arcane blasts, but the creatures were relentless, tearing through her defences with savage ferocity. Zirath was already engaged with two on his own, his great axe glowing with radiant light. Zora saw her plight and bellowed with fury. His eyes burned with rage as he charged toward her, sword in hand, swinging. The first tome exploded under his strike, shredded pages flying. The second tome snapped at Frizz's arm, but Zora grabbed it by its spine and tore it apart with his bare hands, acidic slime sizzling against his skin. As the remaining cursed tomes regrouped, Zirath and Thomas moved in for the kill. Zirath invoked his divine power, raised his great axe high, the light cutting through the gloom of the library, and brought it crashing down onto two tomes at once. The creatures shrieked as they disintegrated under the holy light, their twisted forms reduced to ash. Thomas took advantage of the chaos. With a muttered incantation, he conjured a swirling vortex of dark energy that pulled the remaining tomes into its grasp. They writhed and twisted, snapping at the air, but the vortex consumed them, tearing them apart until nothing remained but scattered scraps of parchment. The battle ended in silence, save for the laboured breathing of the party. Friz slumped against a table, clutching her wounded arm. Her robes were shredded, her face pale, but her gaze remained steady. Zora knelt beside her, offering a rough but reassuring nod. Zirath scanned the room for any lingering threats while Thomas dusted off his cloak. His power felt different here. His patron stirred. Friz consumed a restorative potion, her wounds mending quickly and painlessly. She was still weary despite her mended flesh. A few moments passed. The oppressive pulse of the tower quieted. Silently before them, a spiralling staircase, warping and reshaping itself with every step, materialized. Its unnatural curves straightened, the steps aligning into a clear path upward. Zora's hand tightened on his sword, Zirath on his still glowing axe. Weapons still drawn and eyes sharp, they made the climb, their footsteps echoing softly in the vast library. The staircase beckoned, winding upward into the shadows, toward whatever lay at the heart of the Tower of Deadlore. There would be no turning back now. The stairs opened onto a chamber where windows lined the walls on all sides, though none had been seen from the outside of the tower. Below them, the sprawling library stretched endlessly downward, far lower than the climb they had made to reach this room. Furthermore, the chamber they stood in was impossibly small compared to the massive spire they had seen from afar. Distance and reality twisted here, bending to the tower's will. What was near seemed distant, and what was far loomed impossibly close. The disorienting space reinforced a lingering truth. The Tower of Deadlore was not bound by mortal perceptions of time or space. 4 mirrors stood at equal distances along the black walls, each framed with intricate engravings. As they approached, the swirling runes etched into the glass snapped into focus, appearing ominously in the languages known to each adventurer. The inscriptions spoke of the Great Void, the place inside the mind where one meets their truest self. The glass rippled like water, swirling with dark energy until the surface solidified, showing each adventurer their reflection. Zirath stood tall, his draconic visage reflecting his unshakable resolve. He saw his oaths, his battles, and the burdens of justice etched across his expression, yet his image remained unwavering. Friz leaned in closer to her mirror, her eyes scanning every detail of her reflection with sharp focus. She saw knowledge, the endless pursuit of it, and the price it had extracted from her over the years, but she remained steady, unflinching. Zora's gaze was steady and fierce, his reflection mirroring his strength and battle-worn resolve. He saw the weight of choices made, and those still to come, but there was no hesitation in his eyes. Thomas, however, froze before his mirror. His reflection wavered, darkening as if tainted by shadow. The figure in the glass twisted into something more sinister, a flicker of who he was, distorted. Behind him, the mirror shimmered as his patron Baba Yaga loomed in and out of the reflection, her form strobing with chaotic flashes. The witch's visage twisted unnaturally, her presence sending waves of cold dread that seeped into Thomas's bones. For the first time he felt something from her he had never known: fear. The pressure in his mind grew unbearable, and before he could cry out, Thomas crumpled to the floor, lifeless. His friends moved toward him, but Zirath held them back when he glanced the contents of the mirror. He could not see Thomas's fallen body. Instead, in the glass stood a dark shadow. Deliberately, it stepped out of the mirror, stepping over their friend's body, not bothering to look down. The shadow solidified into a swirling black reflection of Thomas himself. His usual expression of amusement or cool charm was replaced by rage and hate. The dark reflection's intent was clear as he charged at Friz. Zora struck first, his sword cutting toward the shadow's chest, but the dark reflection twisted, dodging with unnatural speed. The shadow lashed out with a blast of black energy, slamming into Zora and forcing him back. Zirath stepped in immediately, his battle axe cleaving through the air. His strike landed, but the shadow's form reknitted itself, oozing dark tendrils from the wound. Friz unleashed a barrage of arcane missiles, each bolt striking the shadow's body. Instead of faltering, the shadow absorbed the energy, growing darker and more menacing. It retaliated, hurling a pulse of dark magic directly at her. Zora saw the blast coming and threw himself between Friz and the attack, his sword raised. He took the hit, staggering but standing firm. Zirath pressed forward, swinging his axe in wide arcs, cutting through tendrils that lashed out to ensnare him. He kept advancing, forcing the shadow back step by step. The creature screeched and lashed at him with jagged claws. Zirath deflected the strike with his shield and retaliated, his axe gleaming with radiant energy. Friz moved quickly, casting a protective ward over the party, but her concentration faltered as the shadow turned on her again. It lunged, and Zora, still bruised from earlier blows, stepped in front of her once more, blocking the creature's path. The shadow slammed into him, sending him to his knees, but he refused to fall. Thomas's body remained lifeless as the battle raged. The shadow circled, seeking weakness. Zirath struck again, his axe biting deep into the creature's leg. Friz, regaining focus, unleashed a wave of fire, forcing the shadow to recoil. The flames burned through the darkness, but the creature retaliated with a desperate blast aimed at Friz. Zora intercepted the blast again, his sword raised. Zirath took his chance, stepping in with a final brutal swing of his axe, cleaving the shadow in two. The dark form shattered into smoke and scattered across the library. As silence fell, Thomas stirred on the floor, his eyes fluttering open. Zora lowered his sword, steadying himself as the others gathered their breath. Thomas, pale and shaken, recounted that his reflection had pulled him into the mirror. Trapped, he saw everything unfold through the shadow's eyes. Worse, he felt its emotions: hatred, fury, a searing rage directed at his friends. His apology was quiet, almost hollow, as he avoided their eyes. While the others tended their wounds, Thomas wrestled with unease gnawing at him. The rage he had felt was not entirely foreign. It was buried deep, but it was there, a bitter resentment he had not acknowledged. His time in Baba Yaga's service had left him isolated for so long that he barely recognized the bonds forming with those around him. He forced a grin, masking his discomfort with charm, but the unease settled like a shadow on his soul. The spiraling staircase at the back of the Hall of Reflection shifted once again, revealing the way higher into the tower. The party climbed each step harder to see as reality bent around them. By the time they reached the next floor, their senses had betrayed them entirely. Colours blurred, edges warped, and their vision twisted. What was far seemed close, and what was near seemed out of reach. At the far end of the room stood a tall, white figure, its form flickering and impossible to focus on. They didn't dare move forward. The disorientation was unbearable. Friz, however, refused to yield. This was a test of the mind, and her mind was her weapon honed through study and practice. Anger sparked in her. She gathered her focus, forcing the noise and distortion to the edges of her thoughts. With intense concentration, she stepped forward, her hand extended to Thomas. Thomas hesitated, then took her hand. The others followed, forming a chain behind her. One step at a time, Friz led them through the madness. The floor rippled and warped, gaping holes in the stone opening just inches from their feet, but she didn't falter. She kept her mind locked on the next step, trusting her instincts. Her focus became their anchor. They moved slowly but steadily. Every sense screamed at them to stop, to turn back, but Friz pressed on, unwavering. She would not fail them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the far end of the room. The white figure flickered once more before vanishing, leaving the party standing on solid ground once again. Friz closed her strained eyes, her head buzzing from the effort, but she stood tall. They had made it through. Zora turned to Friz, gratitude clear in his expression. In the corner of his eye, as his focus shifted between the statue and Friz, was a nearly imperceptible flicker of clarity. The figure was that of a person. Tentacled cracks webbed its surface, and at her base a dance of twisting white smoke. The face was worn and decayed, the features unrecognizable. Yet, in stark contrast to the oppressive blackness of the Tower of Deadlore, this statue radiated something different. Zora turned to his companions and told them what he saw. Zirath, in a rare display of paladin colours, knelt and prayed at the statue. Friz followed, driven by curiosity and respect. Thomas, with hesitation, lowered himself as well, wary yet unwilling to be left out. Finally, Zora knelt in turn. As Zora bowed his head, his vision shifted. The vision was calm, guiding him gently outward as though he were rising above the Deadlore Tower. He saw the realm from a distance, the dark spire clawing upward, black against the swirling void of the black star sea. Colours shifted suddenly, black to white and back again. The tower blurred, pulsing faster and faster, reality fracturing under the weight of the vision. Then, with clarity, Zora saw it. The 7 aspects of knowledge. They floated in front of him, luminous and shifting. But unlike the runes on the door, these forms danced in a circle. Life, death, time, reality, mind, creation, and destruction. They flickered just beyond his reach, tantalizingly close before the vision stuttered and broke apart. He was back inside the hall. Zora gasped, the breath he hadn't realized he was holding rushing out in a shudder. His friends were still kneeling, lost in their own thoughts, waiting for something to happen. Zora whispered what he had seen, his voice steady but tinged with awe. The tower wasn't just a prison for knowledge. It was pulling in the very essence of the banished dark arts. There were pieces of a puzzle forming, yet clarity remained just out of reach. Reality shifted once more as the strange clarity of the Hall of Revelations faded behind them. The staircase before them folded in on itself, curving sideways, then righting again, seemingly unconcerned with the constraints of gravity or direction. Still, the party pressed on, their footsteps echoing. When the stairs finally ended, the scene before them was oddly mundane compared to the twisting chaos they had encountered thus far. Built from the same black obsidian as the rest of the tower, a lecture hall stretched out before them. Rows of tiered seats fanned out toward a central dais, their surfaces coated in thick dust and draped with cobwebs. The air was stale, undisturbed by time or use. It felt out of place, yet eerily fitting. Friz stepped forward first, taking in the strange sight. She was the first to recognize it, not as a physical space, but as an interpretation. The tower was a place of forbidden knowledge, a prison for dangerous truths. This lecture hall was their mind's way of framing that concept. No knowledge here could leave the boundaries of the tower. It was meant to be locked away, never to escape. The realization brought an idea to Friz's mind. They had come seeking knowledge of the Orbs of Vestra. Perhaps they needed to act like seekers of knowledge. With quiet determination, Friz moved toward one of the dust-covered seats and sat down. Her companions exchanged uneasy glances. Zirath followed without hesitation. He lowered himself into a seat, his battle-axe resting across his lap. Thomas, after a brief pause, shrugged and sat as well, brushing away cobwebs with a flick of his hand. He muttered something about feeling like a schoolboy, but he kept his thoughts to himself. Zora, however, remained standing. His instincts told him to be wary. The tower had twisted their perceptions at every turn, and something about this room felt too staged. He crossed his arms, scanning the empty seats and the dais beyond. Nothing stirred. The air remained still. Minutes passed, and still nothing happened. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, ready to stand and abandon the exercise. But just as he began to rise, the room brightened. Light, soft and white, filled the space, casting away the shadows that clung to the black stone. The air shimmered with faint energy. The figure floated into the room, its presence as haunting as it was mesmerizing. The slender form flickered slightly, but onward climbed the stairs of the lecture hall with a purpose, its movements graceful and deliberate. When it reached the dais, the figure turned to face them, raising a hand in acknowledgement, as though saluting those seated in the hall. It stood at the front of the hall, standing silently, observing them. In the blink of an eye, everything changed. The brightness of the room intensified, and suddenly they were standing on the staircase once more. The lecture hall was gone. No seats, no dais, no cobwebs. The black stone path twisted upward endlessly where the figure had stood. No one remembered how they had gotten to their feet or even how long they had been standing. The memory of the hall itself felt distant, slipping from their minds like smoke through their fingers. Confusion flickered across their faces. They exchanged glances, but none of them spoke the question lingering in their minds. What had just happened? The empty staircase stretched onward. There was no sign of the figure now, no echo of the presence, but the meaning was clear. It was an invitation. Friz nodded toward the staircase, the mystery gnawing at her. Without a word, the party began to climb once more toward, seeing a faint, glowing red light above them. They entered a long, dim hallway, its walls carved with an intricate weave of names. Names beyond counting etched into black stone. Some runes, glyphs, and letters were familiar, but most were ancient languages and long dead. The names flowed across the walls like a river of forgotten words, each letter intertwining with the next in an endless, unreadable script. The party walked in silence, the weight of the hall pressing down on them, an unspoken warning hanging in the air. At the far end of the hallway, a black lectern stood. It seemed both distant and near, impossible to measure in time or space. It pulled them toward it with a slow inevitability, and in a moment that stretched into an eternity they reached it. Once again the Lord Mindflayer's presence invaded their minds. The familiar tendrils of thought slithered through their consciousness, freezing them in place as the voice reverberated within them. The question was simple, but absolute. You who seek, you who wish to see, what do you offer? Zirath, resolute and unwavering, stepped forward. He reached into his pack and withdrew the Codex of Karzak, its dark leather cover still stained from their journey. Without hesitation, he placed the forbidden tome on the lectern. The weight of it seemed to ripple through the air. The voice in their minds stirred again, acknowledging the offering. The Mindflayer confirmed what they already knew. The codex was dark, terrible knowledge, its existence a stain upon the world. The lectern absorbed the book, the tome melting into the black stone like ink spilling into water. Red light pulsed from the lectern, flowing into the floor and up the walls, weaving its way into the endless river of names. Karzak's name appeared etched in glowing red, another forgotten figure now bound to the Hall of the Unspoken. The voice told them plainly Karzak's name would never be spoken again. It would drift into obscurity, erased from history, his legacy locked away forever in the tower. Such was the power of the Hall, a place where those who wielded dangerous knowledge were stripped of their voices and cast into silence. A shiver ran through the group. Thomas, ever wary of unseen dangers, couldn't help but feel relief. The Hall had taken Karzak's name, but what if they had spoken one of the others aloud? He muttered to himself that they had narrowly avoided trouble. The Flayer pulsed a chilling confirmation into his mind. His patron stirred again. Before the Mindflayer's presence receded, Friz stepped forward, her expression tense with resolve. She reached into her satchel and withdrew a second offering, the dark, cracked, leather-bound book known as the Soul Render. The air around the lectern seemed to tighten as she placed it down, the weight of its sinister magic palpable. The Mindflayer's tendrils coiled through their minds again, probing the book's nature. There was no mistaking its dark origins: blood magic, rituals of transmutation, and the binding of souls in exchange for material wealth. The Lord Mindflayer lingered on this knowledge, drinking it in as though savouring every twisted spell woven into its pages. The party felt the familiar, maddening rush of dark memories, painful echoes of the tome's past users and victims, moments of desperate bargains made at terrible costs. After a long, dreadful pause, the voice in their minds stirred once more. The Mindflayer noted that it was rare, almost unheard of, for mortals to possess even one such tome of forbidden knowledge. To see two in a single lifetime was beyond rare. It was extraordinary. For this second offering, the Lord Mindflayer would grant them an audience. Was it luck? Was it fate? Friz had taken that book from thousands in the crumbling library of the cursed ruin. She had carried it for months on end, yet here they were. The tendrils loosened, the suffocating grip of the Mindflayer easing. The lectern absorbed the Soul Render as it had the codex, the book's crimson energy flowing into the walls and spreading across the river of names and added to the walls. The Mindflayer's grip loosened, retreating from their minds once more. The oppressive silence of the hallway returned, and the group pressed forward. At the end of the hall, where the river of names flowed endlessly along the walls, the script coalesced into a single phrase, runes etched larger and brighter than the rest. This wasn't a name. It was a title. It read, "The One Who Brings the Light." Zirath's gaze lingered on the phrase, his mind flickering with a thought, something half-formed, like a memory just out of reach. The idea lingered for a moment before slipping away, lost in the haze of the hall's oppressive magic. He frowned, but he couldn't hold on to it. They stood there for a moment longer, taking in the vastness of the hall, before the strange shift of the tower pulled them again. Without realizing how or when, they found themselves back at the entrance to the hallway, the black lectern now far behind them. The staircase loomed once more. The Flayer was waiting. They stepped out of the winding staircase into a void of endless black. The floor beneath their feet felt solid, yet no surface could be seen, the space around them stretching endlessly into nothingness. There was no horizon, no walls, no ceiling, only the oppressive sense that they stood on the threshold of something ancient and vast. Then he appeared. The Lord Flayer emerged from the darkness, his towering form shifting between shadow and substance. His robes billowed like smoke, woven from the same red ether that pulsed through the tower. Tendrils of crimson light coiled around him, extending from his blackened robes, writhing through the void like sentient beings. His gaze burned with crimson fire, his presence suffocating in its intensity. The adventurers stiffened as the Mindflayers pulled them to his mind. Thoughts and memories twisted under his grip, bending to his will, as if they now belonged to him. In his presence his power was unfathomable. His voice echoed through their thoughts, deep and resonant, beginning as a whisper, before shifting into a gravelly growl that carried both menace and curiosity.
So much seen, for lives so fleeting. Mortals wander through worlds of light and shadow, grasping at truths, yet never knowing their weight. Knowledge is a treasure beyond measure. Those doomed to die treat it like coin, to be spent and discarded when it suits you. Tell me, mortals, do you fathom the burden of knowledge? You come here to break the pact, to tear apart the chains of ancient gods, to take what was forbidden. You seek that which was locked away. Prove you can hold the weight of what you desire. Do you understand the price it demands? The sacrifices it requires? We shall see.
The Lord Mindflayer wasted no time in his challenge. His tendrils coiled deeper into their minds, bombarding each adventurer with a barrage of questions, details from past travels, names of people met, landmarks passed. Mundane fragments of their lives surfaced under his scrutiny, each question delivered with cold precision. Zirath was asked about forgotten battles. Friz faced questions on spells and histories she had once read. Thomas was pressed on past schemes, while Zora struggled to recall distant taverns and faces from his travels. The Flayer reflected a dark, undeniable truth. Mortal minds were fragile and imperfect. Every slip of memory seemed to offend him, his tendrils tightening with irritation whenever an answer faltered or came too late. Each lapse was met with punishment. Pain rippled through their thoughts, a searing reminder of their frailty. The Flayer's voice dripped with disdain at the fragility of human recollection. Knowledge forgotten, or worse, misremembered, was unacceptable in this place. Yet when they answered correctly, when they remembered with clarity, the tendrils eased. The Flayer seemed to savour those moments, relenting as though rewarding them for fleeting glimpses of precision. The test was merciless, a brutal lesson in the cost of holding knowledge without error. The Lord Mindflayer's final question hung in their minds, relentless and unforgiving.
Who am I?
The Mindflayer repeated his question. This time, the cold menace in his voice had changed. Zora perceived it, a flicker of something else. Sadness. Regret. In reaction to Zora's perception, the tendrils frayed across their minds, and suddenly everything fractured and connected at once. Their thoughts collided chaotically, memories spilling into each other. Zora's vision of the tower, flickering between black and white, spiraled outward. Thomas's dark reflection from the Hall of Revelation twisted into view, a haunting reminder of shadows they couldn't escape. Friz's deciphering of the Black Lecture surfaced, words of forbidden truths lingering. Zirath's seeing the phrase, "one who brings the light," burned bright in their minds, weaving through the chaos. The 7 sigils on the door, the 7-pointed star. The statue in the headmaster's office, its presence loomed across their shared consciousness, a beacon in the swirling void. They saw her as she was, the founder of the academy, the one who brought light to the darkness. The tendrils swirled faster, binding their thoughts together, and in a single unified voice, they spoke the name that resonated through time. Mystra. The Mindflayer paused. His tendrils slackened, the suffocating pressure easing. He relented. They all dropped to the floor, unaware they had been levitated and bound by unseen tendrils. The towering Mindflayer shrank before their eyes, the swirling mass of black and red ether peeling away like tattered smoke. As the shadows dissipated, the form beneath was revealed, a figure of radiant white kneeling on her hands and knees. Mystra, the founder of the Arcane Institute, the bringer of light, now reduced to quiet weeping, her hands covering her face. Her sobs echoed through the void, heavy with sorrow. She had not heard her name spoken in eons. For an eternity, she had carried the burden of knowledge too dangerous for mortal minds, the darkest spells, forbidden tomes and twisted rituals. That was the secret pact she had made with the gods. The price for teaching magic to her fellow mortals was to bear the weight of its worst consequences. She had done so silently for time immeasurable, in isolation here in the Deadlore, forever guarding what no one else could be trusted to hold, her eternal burden. Friz stepped forward, her hands trembling. Awed and shaken, she knelt in reverence. The enormity of Mystra's sacrifice was overwhelming. The quiet figure before them wasn't a god basking in power, but a keeper of burdens, endlessly watching the horrors mortals created, powerless to intervene. The responsibility of it all, of carrying the darkest truths, had crushed even the brightest light. She held out a hand to Mystra, helping her to her feet. Mystra rose slowly, her white form radiant against the endless void. Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of eternity as she thanked them. She had seen their minds, their burdens, but also had glimpsed at their resolve. In her sacred duty as the keeper of forbidden knowledge, she would grant them what they sought, the dangerous histories of the Vestran orbs. As a final offering of gratitude, Mystra promised them one more boon, the answer to any single question. She dared not push her pact further, but she would use her power to illuminate what she could. The adventurers, somber and unified, reflected briefly before asking the question that haunted them. Master Leyu's vision burned in their minds, the division, the chaos, the throne, and the spider lurking behind it all. They spoke in unison, the words resonating with shared purpose. What was the spider of Leyu's vision? Mystra nodded solemnly, her expression unchanged as she breathed in deeply. The swirling red tendrils of dark knowledge coiled around her, wrapping her form in shadow. When she opened her eyes again, they glowed blinding white, brimming with ancient truth. Several things happened in a blur. Knowledge surged into their minds, the dark origins of the orbs, the web of fate, and the spider pulling the strings. Blinding light consumed them, and in an instant, they were back in the headmaster's office. It was dusk once more. The headmaster still with his head bowed, reciting the incantations that had brought them there, as though they had passed through the void and out again. He was puzzled at their sudden reappearance, and then his eyes drifted upward. Friz caught the headmaster's distracted gaze, following it to the statue of Mystra. The change was subtle, but undeniable. Where once the statue's expression was made solemn by the weight of her eternal duty, she now seemed to have moved to a serene resolve. Friz's eyes lingered on the statue, and in that moment, she understood. Mystra had passed her judgment, and chosen to share her burden. "How curious," breathed the headmaster.
Until next time, fellow adventurers.